Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bedluck Gamer, and today we're talking about a very interesting frame. Today we're talking about the Kobold, which is a controller frame, but not in the standard sense of controller. They are a controller that, rather than controlling the enemy or even your allies, they control the battlefield. Now, one thing I actually find interesting about Kobold, and this is just because Lancer already technically has this, is Kobold is technically the German word for goblin, more or less. So that being the case, it kind of lines up with how there's the Everest, the Chomolungma, and the Sagarmatha, which are all the same mountain, more or less. So it's just something I found funny, and especially because the Kobold is another size one half. Though, unlike many of the other size one halves, you can't really see the dude in here all too well. There, this one could be a full size mech, and you wouldn't know just from the picture alone. I actually really like the aesthetic. I like all the kind of the glowing rods on it and everything like that. Really cool little guy. And it's a very interesting frame. I'm actually very happy with this frame in general, even though on a practical sense, I'm not sure how good the Cobalt actually is. But let's go ahead and take a look at the license so you can judge for yourself. All right, so starting off, we have a kind of a squishier mech. So it's a HP 6 and it has 1 armor. So definitely not as squishy or even the squishiest mech because that 1 armor. But 6 HP is definitely not a lot. So you're definitely going to want to invest in your hull at least a little bit to increase your survivability, especially considering the range of this mech seems to be somewhere in the mid-range. Now, funny enough, we actually have just a normal evasion and E defense, which is pretty rare in mechs, honestly. Usually when stats are kind of reallocated or adjusted, these are one of the first sets of stats that get changed. So, very interesting, but nothing spectacular. They're average in both categories. And we have a heat capacity that is on the upper end of average with a strange sensor range that I think the Minotaur also has, where it puts it firmly in the mid to long range, not quite long range, but a bit more than mid-range range. And it has a +1 to tech attack. So this mech actually can hack, and there's actually some hacking capabilities in it. So kind of being able to really take from a lot of what Horus offers, because even the core bonuses or like the Goblin mech, which is a good sister mech for this one, you can change your Kobold up pretty dynamically inside of just the Horus company, I suppose. Now, the repair capacity, though, is very small. Something I've noticed in the game is that many of the size 1/2 mechs do have very low repair capacity, which actually is kind of strange when you actually think of the practicality of it. But it's well below average. So if you get dinged up pretty bad in a fight, the Cobalt is not really well designed for repeated combats. So something to take in mind when you're taking one out on a mission. Now, its save target is above average, being 11, which is really good. Speed on the low end of average, but still pretty much average. And its system points just a little bit above average. So overall, we got a very systems kind of heavy mech, which with the bonus to tech attack and as well, like not bad sensor range and the pretty decent save target. It makes it for a good mid-range hacker, but of course it offers a lot more than just that. So let's go and take a look at the traits. So first of all, we have the Mimic Carapace. The Mimic Carapace is interesting, to say the least. So as long as you're adjacent to a piece of terrain or hardcover of size 1 or larger, it becomes invisible as long as it remains adjacent to it. Now, this invisibility ceases if it attacks or takes damage. And this is when you start your turn adjacent to it. I don't think I mentioned. So that being the case, it's not too bad, honestly. And the thing is it doesn't specify it has to be terrain larger than you. So if you increase the size of your Kobold for whatever reason, but technically it will still work, which I think is funny. So that's cool, and that's very interesting. And with how much terrain this mech can create, this is an effect you can get off a lot of the time, making your mech very invisible. So it's very solid, especially if you play a lot more defensively and are spending your turns setting the battlefield up for your allies rather than attacking the enemy. Now, they also have a pretty unique active effect, a quick action from with their slag spray. Once per round, they can create a size 1 mount of semi-molten polymer in a free space within range 3 and line of sight. This terrain has 10 HP and 5 evasion, and it grants hardcover. Pretty good. The fact that this mech can just create its own hardcover wherever it wants is very solid, and honestly, depending on the size of your allies, this is a really good way for you to create hardcover for your allies, making the Kobold actually have some really decent defender qualities as well. And you can do this every round. So every round, you can just, bam, produce hardcover for your ally who either just acted or won't be acting until later in the round. So I actually really like Slag Spray, and it gives the Kobold just an innate defender quality, which I really enjoy. Then we have the exposed reactors. So this is very interesting, but I guess it just makes sense. A lot of smaller mechs do have something like this, where it has a difficulty on engineering checks and saves. So a little bit of a balancing factor, and engineering might be one you would put on a Kobold. It depends on, I guess, your style of play, which is something we'll get into a little bit more once we talk about the license proper. It doesn't have a lot of things that create heat, but there are some. So investing in engineering is honestly not a bad idea, but it does make your checks and saves worse. So just something to keep in mind. We have only a singular weapon mount, which makes the Kobold very not offensive, or at least doesn't have a lot of offensive options. But it is a main aux mount, which I thoroughly enjoy. So you can have a main and an aux weapon, or 2 aux weapons. I think that's really good. And with the Kobold especially, it has 2 main weapons in its license. So you can have one of those plus an aux that you can get from GMS or any of the other licenses, depending on how far in the game you are. So not too bad, honestly. It's not great, mind you, but for the Kobold, it's going to be spending a lot of its turn probably creating terrain, because that's a lot of what it wants to do. So firing a weapon is not going to be very high priority. So having only one main, weapon mount that you're using, one weapon mount that you're using, not one main grammar. Anyway, it makes a lot of sense for this particular mech. Now, let's take a look at the core system. It's Terraform, and it has just an active effect, and my face is in the way, so I'm going to go ahead and hide my face. So, what does it do? You extrude up to 10 size 1 cubes of polymer within range 5. Now, these cubes can be stacked up to a maximum of 5 spaces high, and then they can also be made adjacent to each other. And when they are adjacent to each other, they create a contiguous block, essentially, meaning that it can block line of sight. Now, during the first round, after you create it, they are granting you soft cover, and they only have 5 evasion and 10 HP. But after a turn, at the start of your next turn, so pretty much on the next round, the cubes will harden, getting 10 more HP, and as well, they'll be granting hard cover. Though, if they did take any damage, they'll still have that damage recorded. So if they weren't already destroyed, they'll just be getting that plus 10 more. And it's a full action. So this is a very interesting one. But honestly, as far as core powers are concerned, this one is very much, I think, a core power. You can completely change a battlefield. I mean, being able to stack up blocks, you could create a whole building, essentially, as far as terrain is concerned. Like, there are many buildings in some of the pre-made stuff that are like too high, and they're like a 2x3 hex space. So with 6 of your blocks, or not 6, with a majority of your blocks, you can create like almost a full 2x3 size 2 building. It would be 2 hexes less, but that's not a big deal. And it's just something that I think really makes this particular mech stand out as far as what other kind of controller mechs can do, but what mechs can do in general. With Terraform, there's so many situations where, like, okay, you guys are in a hallway and like inside of a structure, and maybe you're fleeing, maybe you have a bunch of enemies coming from a singular direction. Well, the Cobalt can just be like beep boop, drop a bunch of polymer in a hallway, completely sealing it, and the enemies will have to take time destroying each hex, which will have 10 HP and then potentially 20 HP if it is allowed to harden, meaning that that hallway is just done for who knows how many rounds, depending on the amount of enemy fire. And that's if the enemies are packing any kind of major heat. Because honestly, 10 damage is a lot of damage in the game. There's not many weapons that can do that in a singular round. So, you know, it's a very solid defensive capability, being able to just make a battlefield of all kinds of different polymer. I really, really like the Kobold. I think it's a very interesting mech. I love its design. And I think that the license pairs up really well with it. And there's lots of different ways that you can set the Kobold up to make it interesting as well. So we're going to be looking into that. But before we do, if you do owe me a favor and like the video, this gets it out to other people who like Lancer. And there's really just not enough Lancer content out there. So a simple like can help push Lancer content out on YouTube. And as well, if you want to see more content like this, I try to get at least one Lancer video out a week, unless some big event is going on. So that being the case, subscribing will get you more Lancer content. Doesn't sound like a bad deal. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about the license. So first up, the Fusion Rifle, which actually is a pretty good rifle. So the unique thing about this rifle is it's a range 6, but the amount of damage it does is based on the distance between you and the target. So if shooting it at max range of 6 will deal 6 energy damage, while shooting at an enemy adjacent to you, which is already hard to do because it gives you difficulty, will do only 1 damage. What makes this weapon so actually insanely good is it's just a main rifle that you can consistently in some battlefields get 6 with the base movement. As long as you're not adjacent to an enemy right away, and honestly, even if you are, if you boost your agility to at least have a speed of 6, you can just do 6 damage if you hit the enemy easily, reliably. Now, this does depend on how open the battlefield is and possible cover and all that kind of stuff, but regardless of any of that, super easy to deal max damage with this weapon. And even if you're doing like 3 or 4 damage, that's just average like main weapon damage anyway. So this is an insanely good rifle. I actually really like this one. It's just solid. I don't know what to say. I just really like this one. If you're playing a very speedy mech, the Fusion Rifle probably is a really good rifle for you. Also here at rank 1, we have the Forge Clamps. This is actually not a terrible one. It depends on the kind of combat you're in. It's only a singular system point, which is honestly not that bad. But what it allows you to do as a quick action, you can clamp on to an adjacent object or piece of terrain of size 1 or larger, and then you become immune to being immobilized, or you become immobilized, but you become immune to knockback and prone. This effect ends if the thing you're clamped onto is destroyed or if you release the clamp as a protocol. So the fact that you can release the clamp as a protocol is actually really good. You don't have to spend an action or a quick action to essentially let go. But in addition to this, being immune to knockback and prone is pretty good. There are a fair amount of artillery mechs in the game that can knock you prone if you don't roll a really good hull, or a lot of mechs that want to shove you out of position. So Forge Clamps is very solid, and it's very solid on a lot of different mechs for a lot of different reasons. I think this is a very good system for only a single system point. Honestly, if you have the space available, there's no reason not to take this because you never know when it's going to be in handy. But of course, if you have other systems that apply more to your build, makes sense. But there's so many times where I'm making a build and I just have like a point left over. So having some Forge Clamps, honestly, not a terrible idea. At rank 2, along with the Kobold, we have the Slag Cannon, which it's pretty good. So it is another main weapon, this time being a cannon, and it does a D6 energy damage. Now, not as reliable as the Fusion Rifle, but it has an additional effect that if the target is on the ground or a flat surface, after the attack is resolved, a size 1 mound of slag is produced in a free space adjacent to them. The mound is an object with an evasion 5 and 10 HP, and it doesn't seem like it provides cover, which is very interesting. So this is something you can create that gets in the enemy's way, more or less, because you can hit them and then just bloop. Even if you miss, it says only all it says is it once the attack resolves, not even if it hits. So you shoot the enemy, you might not hit them, but you can create a piece of terrain which could put them in a really bad situation. And depending on the type of environment or the type of mech, you might have to force them to climb over that particular piece of slag. It's really cool. Now, this does have a heat 1 to self, but that's not too terrible, and our heat capacity is pretty okay. So even if we don't invest in a lot of engineering, we can still use this pretty reliably as long as the enemy isn't using heat for whatever reason. But other than that, it's pretty good. But yeah, very cool weapon. Also here at rank 2, we have Seismic Ripper. For 2 system points, we get a full action that is pretty cool. So you create a 10-line Seismic Rip, essentially. Now, any characters, which means can be analyzed, so you have to be careful, in the affected area must make a hull save or be knocked prone, and all objects and pieces of terrain automatically take 10 armor-piercing energy damage. If this destroys a piece of the terrain, it explodes and in a burst 1 area. Any characters caught in one of these explosions must make an agility save or take 2d6 explosive damage. If they pass, they take half, so they still take some damage when this gets set up. Each character can only be affected by one of these exploding pieces of terrain once. So what makes this particularly good is a lot of the slag that this particular mech the Kobold creates can be exploded in this way, meaning that, or in addition with like the slag cannon, which if you overcharge, fire the slag cannon as a quick action, and then Seismic Rip, that enemy not only possibly got hit by the slag, but now they need to make a hull save and an agility save. The hull save to avoid being knocked prone, and the agility save or taking 2d6 explosive damage, and even taking half if they succeed anyway, meaning this can just do guaranteed damage, which is very, very solid. Now, it is a full action, so you can do this as much as you have the ability to overcharge, which I think there's a very, very good Seismic Ripper build with the Kobold and using some of the stuff from Harrison Armory, especially some of the core bonuses. So that being the case, I think this is insanely good. Has a lot of potential to do some really interesting things and can be used in a lot of different styles of play because it's a line 10 path. This is perfect if you're playing like an artillery and you want to remove some cover the enemy has, removing that cover and then, overcharging to fire one of your ranged weapons. Pretty potentially very good. So Seismic Ripper is a very solid and blends in perfectly with the Kobold itself. All right, we're on to rank 3 here, and we get Purifying Code. This is a very interesting one. Now, this is a hacking action that has invades, that's 2 system points, and you get either Flaw Plus or Flaw Minus. This one's actually very interesting. Now, for either of these, an enemy can only be affected by 1 Purifying Code at a time, so you can't stack Flaw Plus on a target or stack a Flaw Plus and a Flaw Minus. And this is a much more control-based action in the more standard sense. What it does is you hack the enemy, you invade the enemy. If you succeed, then one of 2 things happen. With Flaw Plus, if they're not adjacent to another character or piece of terrain at the end of one of their turns, the virus you implant explodes and deals a d6 plus 2 armor-piercing explosive damage. Once it explodes, it's called catalyzing for the effect ends. So until the effect ends, they are at constant threat of taking this damage until they eventually do. Now, for Flaw Minus, it's the opposite. If they are adjacent to another character or piece of terrain at the end of their turn, then the virus catalyzes and explodes. So Flaw Plus forces enemies to stick near terrain or allies. Flaw Minus forces enemies to segregate themselves away from terrain or from their allies. Flaw Minus works really well with some of the assassin mechs in the game that want enemies to be alone, while Flaw Plus works really well with any mechs that do area damage because it forces enemies to stay together or take a bunch of damage, or just take a bunch of damage from area damage from like artillery fire. So Purifying Code is insanely good. And if you're playing a hacker mech of some variety or form and you like some of the stuff in Kobold, this is definitely worth the 3 ranks. This is an insanely, and there's like no save, which I think is the craziest part. Yeah, sure, the enemy can technically force themselves to follow the rules of the flaw, and there are some ways to even purge any ongoing effects, but still, this is an insanely good control action because there's no save. And if the invade actually works, they're just screwed in addition to taking the heat from being invaded. So yeah, I really, really like Purifying Code. I think it's really good, and I think there's many hacker mechs that can make good use of this one. And the final system we have here at rank 3, and let's see if the trend continues, and I hate the very last system in every license, and actually that's not going to be the case. Emoliate's actually pretty good. I actually really like this one. So 2 system points, you get Eject Slag and Molten Puncture as different invades, and with Eject Slag, you force the enemy to explode liquid from their reactor in a burst area 2. It doesn't affect them, but affects everyone around them. The affected area becomes difficult terrain, and any character that starts their turn in or enters it for the first time must succeed on an engineering save or take 2 heat and 1 burn. The liquid cools and dissipates at the end of your next turn, your being whoever is using Emoliate. This is really good, and it's insanely powerful. Why it's insanely powerful is, one, if your enemies are being forced to clump together, for instance with Purifying Code, then this is a good way to just nail a bunch of enemies with 2 heat and 1 burn and create difficult terrain for them. The worst part is for the character you're actually targeting, because not only are they going to get heat for being invaded, but now if they want to move, they're going to have to take heat because they have to move through the terrain unless they can fly, which means they're going to take 2 more heat and 1 burn. And if they don't, they just have to sit there and wait for the liquid to go away. So it's very good. It's a very good control action, and it works in perfect conjuncture with Purifying Code, which you also get here at rank 3. So overall, insanely good. Molten Puncture is pretty okay in comparison, but still very good. What it does is until the end of the target's next turn, their reactor shielding is temporarily cracked, and they take 2 burn for each space they voluntarily move. Now, this is not the same as the one that does heat every time they move, though. If you can stack those on an enemy, oh boy, they're in a lot of trouble. But 2 burn is pretty nasty, and the enemy has to make a choice on whether they want to take burn, which is armor piercing and is ongoing potentially, or they have to stop moving. Now, if the enemy has a really good engineering and decent HP, I should say, the burn might not be too terrible, but most of the time, I feel like most enemies are just going to decide to not move because that's very devastating. So both of the rank 3 systems for the Kobold are really good and work well together. And overall, the Kobold is an insanely solid license. It works really well. It offers a lot of different options of play, whether you're playing a tower defense builder where you're building up different pieces of terrain, or it could work really well with turrets or other types of drones as well, or whether you're focusing on like attacking the enemy with a fusion rifle, which is an insanely good rifle, or even the slag cannon to create terrain, and the Seismic Ripper build like I talked about, plus the hacking potential, so you could be a hacking mech. The Kobold blends really well into a lot of different play styles. That's really good. So I think the Kobold is a fantastic license and a fantastic frame overall. But yeah, that's going to be it for the Kobold. Now, next, we're going to be talking about the Sunzi, which is the final, for now anyway, Harrison Armory mech. And next on the Horus side, we have the Lich as the final mech. So we're getting down here to the end. We only have 2 more left in IPS North Star, and we only have 2 more left in Smith Shimano. So I know a lot of you have been aching for me to cover your favorite mix, and soon we'll have them all done. Then I might look into third-party content or maybe some other things. I'm not quite sure what I'll do afterwards. I'll probably do some build videos as well. I think that's a very fun way to kind of take a look further into Lancer, but I don't know. Let me know in the comments below what you think I should cover after I get done with the rest of the licenses. But that's going to be it for me. Thank y'all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.